This is Research Like a Pro, episode 161, Research Like a Pro with DNA eCourse, part 4. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Diana?
I am doing well. I am in the finishing up stage of a client project, and it's been really fun to come up with a good hypothesis for the client's unknown ancestor. You know, we were talking earlier about how in these research projects, we always think, why didn't I just start with the record that gave me the answer? But, you know, of course, we don't know what's going to give us the answer. So we go through our research plan, and then we finally end up with something good. So that's kind of the way this project was. But it was fun because the client has an ancestor with the surname of Mackenzie, and we think there's a Scottish link, and it's early in Alabama, early 1800s. And I was able to find this whole group of Mackenzies that had land patents in the county, 1828 to about 1852. And, you know, we always do clustering when we have cases like this. And I was able to find the ancestor and one of these other gentlemen back in a county in North Carolina. So a really good place to go study next. You know, I'm not sure if it's the right connection, but this ancestor's associate was from Scotland. He lived past 1850 and kept naming Scotland as his home country. So fingers crossed that maybe that will lead us to a Scottish location. So it's been kind of a fun project.
Wow, that is fun. Good job.
Well, we have a listener spotlight today. This is a comment on the podcast by Elizabeth. I really enjoyed this podcast. I'm doing my first Research Like a Pro with DNA project, so this is very timely for me. I'm working through the book chapter by chapter, but listening to someone else discuss it was very helpful. I can't wait to hear the next episodes. So thanks for leaving that comment, Elizabeth. We agree that it's really fun to listen to Allison as she's been walking us through her experience with the process.
Welcome, Allison. We're glad to have you back today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. It's been fun to talk about it too.
So last time we went through some of the tools you explored and the locality guides and things. So now it's time to start working on a research plan. So let's review your objective and then we can get started with talking about your plan.
Yeah, so my objective for this research project is to use DNA and genealogical records to determine the biological father of Mary Ella Parker, who was born on the 22nd of August, 1877 in Baldwin County, Alabama. Mary Ella died on the 28th of December, 1950 in Columbus, Muskogee, Georgia. The test taker is 3 generations from the research subject, and autosomal DNA will be applicable. However, third to fourth cousins may not share very much DNA, which could make verifying the exact relationship difficult. The community of the research subject also experienced pedigree collapse, so there may be multiple most recent common ancestors with the test taker, and mitochondrial DNA is not useful in this case as it is not an unbroken maternal line, and Y DNA is not useful in this case as it is not an unbroken paternal line.
All right, great. So what did you do first for your research plan?
So for my research plan, I started by looking at what I already knew. I started with my traditional records because that was what I was most comfortable with. For Mariella, I knew that she was born around 1877. The sources are fairly inconsistent. There's a range from 1877 to 1885, but the sources are pretty consistent that her parents seem to be William Parker and Zella Beck. And then I also noted everything says she was born in Alabama, but based on where the family was at the time of her birth, it was most likely Baldwin County. And then her family moved to Santa Rosa County later in her life, and then she married James Henry Sutton in 1904.
So you had really pretty solid evidence that she was the daughter of William and Zilla, because on the 1880 census it lists relationships, and they listed her as a daughter, right?
Right. And in the 1900 census, and her death certificate lists them as her parents. And she's in all of her siblings' obituaries, and all her siblings list William Parker and Zilla Beck as her parents. So I wasn't really questioning it until I had a cousin contact me and let me know that Mary was actually the daughter of Zilla Beck's first husband, Mr. Barnes, and that she adopted the Parker name. So that's why I decided to approach this problem with DNA.
So interesting. So you did a summary of the facts about Mary Ella Parker, and then did you also do summaries for the two hypothesized fathers?
I did, to make sure I knew exactly where we were starting with everything we knew. For William Parker, I had a pretty big range for his birth based all on census records, 1842 to 1855, but they all say he was born in Texas. And then his parents on these records say they were born in Alabama or Georgia. So I thought that was interesting that he was from Alabama, lived in Texas, and then came back to Alabama. And then the 1900 census says him were married around 1875. And remember, Mary's hypothesized birth date is 1877. However, we don't have an official marriage record for that. That is just the 1900 census that tells us that. And then he kind of disappears before the 1920 census. The last record I have for him is a 1916 deed. So I think he must have died somewhere in between there. And then for Mr. Barnes, I know very, very little about him because I call him Mr. Barnes. So the way I found out about his existence is in the census records, there are Barnes children and Parker children. And the Barnes children are listed as stepchildren of William Parker. So that infers that Zilla did have a first husband named Mr. Barnes. And the first two children are born 1860 and 1865. And then the next one is 1874. So there was a gap there.
Yeah, so those blended families, and when you don't have marriage records, those are tricky to figure out the parentage of the children.
I was just confused when the cousin contacted me because there is that like 10-year gap that I thought, no way, she's a child of Mr. Barnes. But I just still thought I would approach the problem with DNA and figure it out. And it was a good project to learn with.
Yeah.
That is a big gap, and certainly it would make sense that she would be part of the second marriage. Well, in the summary of known facts, after you summarize the traditional research and kind of the documents, it's good to do a summary of the DNA evidence that you have before you get started with researching more. So tell us about what you had for that section.
Yeah, so for this, I tried to show the DNA proving the relationships up to this point. So actually no other descendants of her grandfather, Louis, have tested except for Leslie, my mother-in-law, and her father, Philip, are the only two. They've both given me permission, by the way, to use their names in these podcasts. But their DNA did show that they were father and daughter, which is good. That would have been dramatic. And, Philip is still alive, and he knows his dad was Louis Sutton. And then there were a lot of descendants of Mary Ella Parker, who's the next generation back. So I was able to make a chart and put that in my research plan to show we are descended from Mary Ella Parker. And then I was able to make charts showing descendants from both the Barnes and Zilla Beck and William Parker and Zilla Beck. So that shows that we are descended from Zilla Beck, but we do not know which husband we're descended from.
So some of them are probably half relationships and others are full, but maybe it's overlapping and unclear with the centimorgans. So that's tricky.
Yeah, trying to figure out what all of it means was definitely the challenge of this project.
So you've got your summary of known facts, both from the documents and from the DNA evidence. So the next step is to come up with a hypothesis. So how did that work for you?
What I like about the hypothesis part of the research plan is I'm allowed to just kind of say what I am thinking and, this is what I'm trying to prove. But I've learned in your classes, just as much as I'm trying to prove it, I am trying to disprove it because I can fall into confirmation bias very easily. But I like writing down the hypothesis because it gets my thoughts. Okay, this is what I'm thinking at this point in the project. And it's a good starting point. So I wrote that the hypothesis for this research project was that William Parker is the biological father of Mary Ella Parker because she was born in 1877, which is 2 years after the reported marriage date of William and Zillah in 1875. And it seems unlikely that Mary would be a biological descendant of Mr. Barnes because of the 10-year gap between the first Barnes children and her, and also the fact that they're naming the other Barnes children with the last name Barnes, and she's a Parker. So if she is biologically a Parker, it would be expected that her matches with William Parker would be in the third cousin range from 0 to 234 centimorgans with an average of 73 centimorgans. If she's not biologically a Barnes, they would be half third cousins sharing 0 to 168 centimorgans with an average of 48. But because it is a few generations back, that is kind of hard to show, especially with the added pedigree collapse and endogamy, because some matches share multiple common ancestors. So they're showing an average of 73 centimorgans, but it's just because we come from multiple common ancestors.
Yeah, that really muddies the waters, doesn't it? That pedigree collapse.
Yeah, that's something I had to, and I don't know if I totally figured it out, but I did have to work with that during this project.
Yeah, you have to take it into consideration. So your hypothesis basically was that William Edward Parker was the biological father because everything traditionally was looking at that. So you're going to build your research plan to see what you can find.
Great. So before we go to the next step, I have a burning question.
Okay.
So why did the cousin think that it was Mr. Barnes? Did she have some kind of oral family tradition, or what was it?
Yeah, she came from, Amanda is Mary Ella's youngest sibling, Amanda Parker. And Amanda Parker was her great grandmother, this cousin, and her grandmother is still alive. So Amanda Parker's daughter is still alive. And Amanda Parker's daughter was the one that I was sharing this research with them, that we were working together on some stories. And her grandmother said, "Oh no, Mary Ella Parker was not my mom's full sibling. They were half siblings." So that's why that started.
Well, that's a pretty good person.
I know,
She's a
which I
witness
was,
to that relationship, I
I was
guess.
like, dang it.
But she wasn't there when the baby was conceived, so she
Well, and
never
she
knows.
also said the family was estranged. So like she has no memories of the aunt. And
Oh.
there is another member of the family named Mary Ida Parker, who is a Barnes descendant. So I thought when they first said, I said, oh, this woman is getting Mary Ella and Mary Ida confused
Mhm.
because I know William Parker is her dad. That's the only thing that makes sense. But I decided to do this project and try it out.
All right, so let's go to the next part of your research plan. So this is the identify different sources that could help you and then prioritize them. So to identify them, you get to brainstorm, which is fun. How'd that go for you?
So I really like identify sources because I am a chase shiny object person, which is why I need research like a pro. So for identified sources, I am able to put all my ideas down and then not worry about them anymore. You know what I mean? Because I know I wrote them down. So I went through my locality guide and wrote down any place that I thought would help me answer my question. And then I also went back through lesson 6, which was exploring DNA tools and methodology. And you have a great little worksheet that you provide in that where you have all the different tools separated. So I went through each of those and I said, okay, this could help me this way. This could help me this way. This could help me this way. And that helped me brainstorm, okay, what do I think is actually going to help me the most? And then I also was able to keep it there so that when I'm looking for future research, I can just go back to that list I made.
I like that. So after you finished brainstorming all the different tools that you might want to use and different documents you wanted to look at, how did you kind of narrow that down to the few that you wanted to actually do this time?
I started with my traditional sources and I thought I really need to find that marriage record for William Parker and Zillah Beck. The family notes say that they got married in Covington County, which is where Zillah was from. But I think that they might have been in Baldwin County by the time of the marriage because they were there in 1880 and I can't find them in 1870 anywhere. So I decided to look for marriage records in Baldwin County, Alabama. That was my first thing I wanted to do. And then the second thing I wanted to do was look for guardianship records for the Barnes children because if Zillah got remarried, these guardianship records should exist. So the big question is, are they in Covington County or Baldwin County? If they're in Covington County, that's really bad because all the records there were completely destroyed like before 1890 or something like that. Whereas Baldwin County has more records. So I wanted to look for those. And then I also wanted to figure out when the family showed up in Baldwin County. So I put tax records there to try and get in between those census records. And then I also wanted to look at Galveston County to try and find some Parker families there. That could be William Parker's family, because that could help me sort through the DNA matches quicker if I was able to find a hypothesized family. And then I know nothing about Mr. Barnes. And so there were two known children through Mr. Barnes, William and Sarah. And I have William's death date, and I've worked with the Florida Department of Health, and I actually have this certificate that says we cannot find this death certificate. It does not exist, which is very frustrating because I wanted to name his parents.
Mm-hmm.
And then Sarah, she disappears before 1900, the other daughter. So I think that she must have died before then. So I wanted to look for death records for her in Baldwin County, which is kind of hit or miss because they didn't keep them consistently to like 1907. But there are some in Baldwin County that I was going to look through.
I hope that it panned out. I guess we'll find out
Yeah.
in the next part.
Yeah, that's a great priority. I think sometimes it's tricky to figure out which thing to do first, but when you write it all down and then you have your plan, it's so nice to go into the research stage and just go write down your plan. What did you do for your DNA research plan? Because that's the other half of this process.
Through all the earlier steps, I had been tracking cousins that, oh, that's an interesting match. That's an interesting match. But I hadn't really built their trees or really dived into them. So that was my first step, was to kind of go back through those matches that I had noted in my Airtable throughout the earlier steps in the process and really build their trees and figure out how we were related. And then I did want to try segment triangulation as well and see if I could find which segments were specifically coming from Zillah and figure out if any of them were not on the Beck line, but on the paternal line. And then I also thought I could use the auto tree on genetic affairs that I made in the last lesson to figure out these common ancestors that were showing up in other trees and how they were related to our tree.
And that you just had 3 things. You didn't try to do 10 more tools. You just focused on some specific things. So I think that's so important with DNA, to not chase the shiny objects of all these various tools, but to really think through what will be the most beneficial. So good job.
Thanks. Yeah, I learned very quickly that just building your matches trees could be the entire project, because that was very time consuming and not an easy step to just check off.
That's so true. But it is pretty key to the whole process, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely is helpful.
Well, then let's go jump into this. Tell us what happened when you followed your plan and you started building trees for these shared matches that you thought were interesting.
So one of the ones that I just was dying to look at, but I was trying to follow the process and be a good student. He was a descendant from William W. Barnes. And that was the name of the son through Mr. Barnes and Zillah. But through my traditional research, he didn't have any children. So I was very excited to look at this. And so I started building this tree using ancestry hints, used a lot of obituaries, and I figured out this was probably a different William Barnes than the son of Zillah. But it was still a Barnes match, where that was one of the ancestors I was looking into. So I built out their tree and I kept track of all their surnames on Airtable and everything. And then I started looking at the shared matches. And as I started building this match's shared matches, I found that we actually were not related to them through the Barnes line, but that we were related to them through their maternal line. So then I was able to decide, okay, this is probably not a Barnes descendant. But what was interesting is the maternal line came from Texas, which is where the other hypothesized father is from, William Parker. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But I wasn't sure also if endogamy was a problem here. Like maybe we were related through the Barnes line and I just wasn't finding that common ancestor. So I was still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it's hard when you're just like looking at that one name that really stands out, and then you realize it's kind of a red herring and
Yeah.
they're actually related on the other side of the family. Dang it. But that's good that you were able to rule out that possibility that the William W. Barnes was Zilla's son. So that was good.
Yeah. That would have also been another thing where maybe I need to question all of my traditional research. I don't know what I'm doing.
Just question everything.
Yeah.
So did you have another match that you were looking at?
So I built a lot of trees, and as I did that, I was having a really hard time finding common ancestors even between the trees. So I didn't know if I was doing something wrong or if the endogamy was just intense. Building trees also was kind of its own learning curve, especially when you had someone that only had like private, and then a last name, on their tree. And I started actually looking up people on Facebook and stuff. I don't know if you're supposed to do that, but that actually helped me figure out the next generation back and kind of get past that living person wall. And then I could build their trees for the matches that I thought were helpful, but didn't have good trees on Ancestry.
Absolutely. Facebook is such a good tool for finding the living and getting, like you said, past that wall. So good job. There's some really good tools out there, but Facebook is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is what we have to do because you have to build those trees and you use whatever clue you can.
People have a lot of good genealogy information on Facebook.
It's so true.
Here's me and my 3 generations, mom and grandma.
Or, they will often put up an obituary of a deceased parent. There's good stuff out there.
Yeah, I do have a newspaper.com subscription, which I used a lot in the building of trees to find obituaries.
Yeah.
So that was really helpful.
Another one of my very favorite things to do. If you can get an obituary that gives all their siblings and the people who were previously deceased, and then the pallbearers who are often grandsons or sons, oh yeah, those are full of great things. Well, let's see what happened when you were working on your segment triangulation step of your DNA research plan.
So here I was not as successful as I probably wanted to be. There were only 4 known Parker matches that I found on GEDmatch. So I was doing this segment triangulation, and once again, as I was building trees for the ones I didn't know, I had a known Parker descendant, Leslie, and then the third person we matched with, and I could not find the common ancestor, and I was so frustrated. So I just kept trying, and I did it for so many people, and I learned a lot about segment triangulation and DNA painter and all those good things. But I was realizing I think endogamy is this really big wall that I need to figure out how to overcome before I'm going to find some answers.
Yeah, sometimes, just depending on the DNA you're working with in the families, it can be easy to find the common ancestors, and other times it can be really a problem. So I have just found with all the different client work and my own DNA work that every case is so different. So it sounds like you started off with one that was kind of a challenge, even though you didn't think it was going to be that hard.
I thought it was going to be straightforward.
That's how it works out for me too sometimes. When I chose my case study for ProGen, I thought, oh, I'm going to choose something that I already know the answer to, and I just need to write up all the evidence. And in writing up all the evidence, I realized how it was not an open and shut case at all.
Yeah, that whenever I write it down, I realize how much confirmation bias I'm using, and I'm like, oh, dang it, I have to think a little bit more outside the box.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about what you learned about endogamy, because it sounds like this was kind of a stumbling block and you did a little research to learn about it.
Yeah, and I would say that this was probably the most important part of my research that I did, educating myself on endogamy. So you guys had talked about Paul Woodbury's legacy webinar on endogamy, but I don't have that subscription right now. So I found some articles where he talked about it on Legacy Tree. And he just defines it as endogamy is the custom of marrying only within the limits of a local community, clan, or tribe over the course of many generations. Members of endogamous populations may descend from a limited pool of founder ancestors who represented the initial genetic makeup of their population. And then he also defines pedigree collapse. because we use both those terms. And he says pedigree collapse occurs when two related individuals produce offspring. As a result, the number of unique individuals occupying locations in a pedigree decreases or collapses. Pedigree collapse is not the same as endogamy. However, recent cases of pedigree collapse in an individual's tree and long-term endogamy can have similar effects on DNA inheritance. When practiced over multiple generations and over the course of several hundred years, continued pedigree collapse can lead to endogamy. So that helped me understand what I was dealing with a little bit more, because I'd heard the terms, but just reading it helped me understand it. These were two different articles, and I linked to them in the blog post for anyone dealing with the problem and want to go read them. But one of the things he says to do to overcome it is to test multiple individuals, which may be difficult, but I had Leslie's DNA and Leslie's father had his DNA on Ancestry. And, I know him, he's my grandpa-in-law. So I was able to call him and say, okay, I need access to your DNA in order to kind of figure out this problem.
Yay! That's one of the greatest things that you can do is get more test takers when you're dealing with a tricky problem. So I'm excited that you were able to get his results to use.
Honestly, if I were to go back, I would have done it at the very beginning, but I just didn't realize how helpful it would be to have more than one person's DNA. So when I got his DNA, it pretty quickly helped me realize where my problem was, because when I'd done the Leeds method analysis for her, you're supposed to get 4 genetic networks showing your 4 great grandparents. And I had 5 for her. So I was like, okay, she has some pedigree collapse in there. She's from the South. That's expected. And then I did Philip's DNA. And so remember, he's a generation closer. Mariella is his grandmother. And I found 15 genetic networks instead of 4. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is insane pedigree collapse. So I had quite a big problem on my hands. So what I did was I went through each of the 15 networks and I decided, okay, what last name is really being represented here? And I think I found 4 Parker. In the 15, there were 4 Parker networks. So I went through the people in there and I found which people didn't have overlap with the other networks. And then I reached out to those people.
That is a lot of work.
Yeah, it was.
Did you keep track of all this in Airtable?
Yeah, I kept track of a lot of it in Airtable. I did a lot of it in Excel with the Leeds method and just kind of wrote down notes on that matches box. I think I need to figure out a better system for how I did all of it. Airtable is really helpful, and it was a new tool for me in this project too. So now that I've done working on some of the other things I'm able to use Airtable a little bit more efficiently to do things like this.
Yeah, it's interesting because with one project you can do things a certain way, but then you run into something like this and all of a sudden you're trying to decide how to log it, how to keep track of it, and you just have to think outside the box. And do you need to create a new page? Do you need to,
So I think I added a new column called genetic networks and I colored them. So I would put people in whichever multiple, kind of like the Ancestry dot system, but on Airtable.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, you just have to figure out some way to keep track of this information, because once you find those matches that don't overlap anyone else, you want to make sure you know who they are. So
yeah,
one of the great things about keeping everything in a research log, that's for sure.
Absolutely. So these people, there was only a few of them that were only in one genetic network, and they didn't have awesome trees. So I was trying to build them, but I was getting pretty stuck. Well, I messaged a few of them, but one of them responded. His name was Mark, and he also has allowed me to use his name. And he was so helpful. And turns out he was actually adopted, which is why I wasn't able to build his tree, because the names weren't making sense. So he shared his DNA with me as well, which honestly was the key to unlocking this research.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I love it. So this is Ancestry?
Yes, this is all on Ancestry.
So you found a guy on Ancestry who shared his results with you, and now you can start like you just did with your grandpa-in-law from the beginning and try to organize his matches and see what you can find from his family. So how did that turn out?
It was so great because he did not have pedigree collapse, because his mother is from Colorado and his father is from Florida. So he had 4 distinct groups of his grandparents. And I had never seen that in DNA before, and I was so excited. So I found out that he was the great grandson of Virgil Mosley and Mary Ida Parker. which is a different person than Mary Ella. I don't know why they named them that, but they did. So Mary Ida, based on my traditional research, my understanding is that she is a granddaughter of Zillah Beck through that first daughter, Sarah Barnes. And that when Sarah died, William and Zillah adopted Mary Ida and her siblings and changed their surname to Parker.
Wow.
So this is my understanding of it. And Mark's DNA did show that he came from Mary Ida. And so then I wanted to see if Mark and Grandpa shared DNA that was not shared through the Beck line, if that makes sense. So any DNA that they did not get from Zillah Beck, I wanted to know if they had something else, because to me that meant that they would have a paternal ancestor. And I did find a group that did not share any DNA with the Beck line, but was sharing DNA with both Mark and Grandpa.
That's exciting because you've got to wonder if it's not coming from Zillah, who you know is one of their common ancestors. Who's the other guy it's coming through then?
Right. And I'm pretty sure that Mark is a Barnes descendant because he was sharing DNA with the Parker descendants as if they were half descendants. And like I said, his DNA was much cleaner and you could separate it a lot easier than the pedigree collapse populations I was working with.
Right. And that traditional research was showing that Sarah Barnes was clearly a Barnes on that 1880 census, right? Who was the mother of Mary Ida.
Right. This was pointing to me that perhaps we are Barnes related and not Parker related.
Fascinating.
So interesting. So, as you were working with Mark's DNA, you came up with a different couple that you had not worked with before. Is that
I
right?
did. Yeah, one of the big questions with this whole thing is I'm not running into the surnames I want ever. But as I was going through this group of matches with Grandpa and Mark that didn't share DNA with Zillah, so what I believe to be paternal matches to Mariella, I found this common ancestor in multiple of these matches trees, Frank Ward and Mary Brooks. Frank was born in 1842, which is about the same time that Mariella's father would have been born. He was born in 1842 in Alabama, and he died in Texas. And also, as I was looking through his census records, and while he was living in Texas, he was neighbors with Barnes from Alabama. So that was interesting to me. And then another thing that was interesting was that in the 1880 census, the Parker family is neighbors with a Ward family. So there were some connections there, but I didn't quite figure out exactly what the connections were, because I started trying to figure out who Frank's parents were just based on ancestry hints, and I made a timeline for him. And all the family trees on Ancestry, so the authored sources, were saying that William Richardson Davy Ward and Henrietta Marie Vivian Ward were his parents. However, I found a letter for pardon for William Richardson Davy Ward, where he lists every single one of his children. And the child that was getting confused for Frank was actually named Leonidas, but the L, he normally went by L G Ward, and Frank is Frank G Ward, and the L and the F kind of looked the same in that cursive. So after comparing timelines and finding that source, I decided that this might not be the correct parents for Frank, and I might need to do my own research project to find his parents.
Well, you have found a lot of information as you're doing this research. One of the things that I have a challenge with is you follow your research plan and you have all this information and so many thoughts, and you have to start getting it down somewhere. I mean, you're logging it, but you're probably thinking it's time to start writing.
Yeah, I did that because I'd spent a lot of time and I had so many thoughts in my head. And I said, okay, I need to start writing this down to kind of know where my next direction needs to be. I also want to know, I did follow my traditional research plan. I didn't write about it because it was the DNA eCourse and I was so focused on that. And also everything came up as NIL, not in location, not in location, not in location, not in location. So my traditional research plan was not as exciting as my DNA, but I did follow both research plans. And I think it was probably about 20 hours, possibly more. And after I got to this Frank Ward problem, I realized I probably just needed to start a new project, just focusing on Frank or focusing on finding that next generation back for him. And I didn't want to muddy up my project or muddy up my brain. So I wanted to stop and write down what I had found.
Yeah, that really is helpful because as you're writing it, you make more connections.
Yeah, which I really did. And we'll talk about that then when the next time I come on. But
Yeah.
writing it just really made the puzzle pieces fall together for me.
Wow, you really got led down a different path than what you would have thought. But how great that you were able to follow those trees and get more information from additional test takers. It seems like you had good success with your DNA research plan. And that's a bummer that your traditional resources didn't lead to any breakthroughs. But that's why it's so fun to work with DNA, because oftentimes we don't find anything in the documentary research, and it's disappointing and frustrating. So it's exciting to have a new avenue to pursue and to have a future research suggestion.
Definitely. And I was not super surprised by the traditional research since I had done research on this family for a while. And I think they were in Covington County where all the records were destroyed, because they're not really showing up in Baldwin County until right around 1880.
That would make sense. Yeah. So, as you follow your plan, you're supposed to keep a research log. So, tell us about your experience with doing a research log.
Yeah, I did keep a research log. It's a little different with DNA because the sources are different. And sometimes, you're just using a tool and you're not thinking of it as searching a source. So I had to kind of train myself to write down everything I was doing in my research log. But I really needed it. When I was building those trees, it was so important. I was keeping a research log to know what I was doing, how I was searching for each of those ancestors, for the matches. So I just was using Airtable, which has a lot of really cool tools relationally. So you can connect the match and you can connect the ancestor. So it was different doing it with DNA, but at the same time, it was just when you do something for your research, put it in your research log, write down what you learned from it or what questions you got from it. And it just helps keep everything ordered so that it's not just all in your brain taking up space.
Yes, that's one of the greatest things about keeping track of everything you do in your plan and your log is getting it out of your brain. And it's just like the getting things done method where he says you've got to get it out of your brain and onto paper so that it doesn't clutter your mind and free up space for thinking. So that's great. I'm glad that that was something that was an outcome for you with logging.
Yeah, especially with DNA, there are so many different names that you're dealing with. So it's really important to keep track with it with a log, because when you walk away and you come back, you're not going to remember all the details about all these different people you're working with.
So true. There's so much data to keep track of. That's what I found as well. Good job.
One of the things that I love about Airtable is the page where you note all the localities in the trees that you are searching through. And I found that really helpful, as well as the surnames, because you're going through these trees really quickly. And it's so nice to look and go, oh, wow, I found 5 trees that have the surname of Ward or Brooks or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly how I did it with the Ward and Brooks, because I don't think I would have remembered going through all those trees because I'd gone through so many trees at this point. And Ward and Brooks are both kind of common names. So I don't think it would have hit me if I hadn't been keeping track of it through the surname tool in my Airtable.
Yeah, I found that that works so well. Well, one thing we didn't talk about was, making these trees in your ancestry tree and floating branches. So I'm guessing that you did that as well, that you built some of these trees just right within ancestry.
I did on my private tree that I just named DNA research. And that helped me. I could look at these hints and these other trees, and I could add things to my tree as hypothesis, without worrying about it messing up everybody else's research if it wasn't correct. So yeah, I used a lot of it on my practice tree on Ancestry.
That's really helpful. I'm excited to go through your research report, and when you report to us what you found out, that'll be so fun to find out now that we've taken a deep dive into your project. So thanks so much for being on and leading us through your process. I think everyone listening really learned a lot about what you can do with your DNA when you actually have a process.
Yeah, definitely. And it just helped me get over so many learning walls. And now that I've done one project, I can approach other projects now and it won't be as scary.
And everyone will be different, but that's the fun.
Yeah, you're always learning.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you guys again next week.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our Research Like a Pro online course or join our next study group. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our eCourse or study group. If you like what you heard and would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.